If you could start, could you introduce, um, introduce yourself, please, if you could?
Yeah, my name is Susan Von Kratz. I live outside of Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and I'm an occupational therapist by trade.
Mm-hmm.
I've been practicing for over 36 years, and I think you asked me to explain what an occupational therapist is.
I did, yeah, yeah, for sure.
Well, our profession is a it's a funny thing. Our profession. It's occupational therapy is a contextual term.
Mm-hmm.
It's contextual based on what our interests are as a profession,
Mm-hmm.
what setting we work in, who we work with, if it's orthopedic or neurologic. And so we can't be defined by our education.
Mm-hmm.
There are other professions that can be defined by what they're trained in, but an occupational therapist, we're trained to be problem solvers. A little bit of history dating back to World War One. The massive amount of soldiers that were coming back to the United States and Europe as well after World War One were housed in these big mansions by wealthy people and tended to by nurses and physicians. And of course, they're overwhelmed because there's so many of these soldiers. And our history dates back to the nurses and doctors who observed that the soldiers who were occupying their selves, their time with purposeful activity, actually got better and they recovered faster and they got over what at that time was called shell shock, which we now know as PTSD. So the nurses and doctors working with those soldiers helped create a the birth of a profession, and at that time we were called restorative aids. So our early ancestors of our profession worked with soldiers to get them ready and prepared, and what would it take to get them into purposeful activity, whether it was a job or
Mm-hmm.
just being able to take care of their own personal needs. Those were the tasks that were meaningful, that
Mm-hmm.
occupied their time. As more and more information about health and wellness and uh, just this reformation of healthcare in this country, as more things were learned and specialized, you'd see a division of restorative aids becoming occupational therapy, physical therapy, eventually speech therapy,
Mm-hmm.
recreational therapy. There were just these divisions based on not just interest, but also probably the way people thought.
Yeah.
Um, and occupational therapy as a profession, our education is about gestalt thinking. We
Mm-hmm.
see the whole picture.
Mm-hmm.
And in our basic training in the university, we're taught to be a problem solver, which means when we look at the human body, the human condition, we look at the underpinnings of how we do what we do. Um, so, how does the brain work? How does the body work? How does biology work? Um, how does our psyche work and our emotional and our motivation and our interests? And how does that all work as a whole so that each human being can find their purpose and their passion and have a quality of life? So,
Mm-hmm.
as an occupational therapist, I have training to analyze each person's situation to see how I can help and what
Right.
skills I have. Um, so that's my interpretation of occupational therapist.
Nice.
Yeah,
That's
vague,
awesome.
vague, but historically accurate.
Yeah, for sure. Absolutely.
Yeah,
So, I'll just keep going down the line here.
sure.
So, What tools do you use to e sorry
It's okay.
to evaluate the the patients?
The tools that I've gathered in my 3.5 decades. Um, First and foremost, I want to emphasize that every single patient that I've worked with has been my teacher.
Interesting.
So I learn something about my whole trade
Mm-hmm.
and my whole repertoire of what I can do based on everybody that comes into my office. So what I learn from one client is going to help the next client.
Mm-hmm.
Bits and pieces, and sometimes it's big insights, and sometimes it's little insights, and sometimes each client I work with may just give me some affirmation of what I've been doing with previous clients. Let me tell you my background of that trail of how
Mm-hmm.
I got to where I'm at today,
Okay.
which shapes my opinions and my interpretations
Yeah.
and my philosophies. When I first started as a therapist, I was actually working at a trauma center hospital in Pittsburgh. And there I got to work with anything and everything that happened to the human person.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Head trauma, brain injuries, spinal cord injuries, burns, psychiatry. I worked on a inpatient psychiatric unit, addictions, alcoholism,
Mm-hmm.
you name it. Every 3 4 months I got to learn from those folks going through some pretty challenging situations.
Yeah, for sure.
After a few years there, I became real interested in traumatic brain injury and how the nervous system, the brain, and the spinal cord recover after some kind of injury or illness. And so I took another job across town at a internationally known rehab center where I specifically was working with traumatic brain injuries, people in car accidents
Mm-hmm.
or
Yeah.
traumatic blows to the head.
Yep.
And in that setting, I I gathered as much information and skills and training, and there's as therapists we go to ongoing trainings as more and more things are learned and evolved. We go to continuing ed trainings to gather more skill competencies. So I was learning all of this area we called functional neurology.
Mm-hmm.
If somebody lost the ability to hold their head up in gravity, I learned how to help them master gravity again.
Right.
Somebody lost the ability to coordinate their left and right sides of their body, I found strategies to help them move and get that left and right side
Mm-hmm.
um, connected through their actions. So we call that whole area called neuro rehab or neurological rehabilitation. And at that point, I started getting a lot of children and adults with, or young adults with autism. This was in the early 80s and going into the 90s. And we didn't know much about it at that time. But what I observed with those children is that their behavior was very similar to kids who had had traumatic brain injuries.
Mm-hmm.
And so we started applying the same interventions and the same strategies with those children, and they responded positively. Even though at that time autism was considered a behavioral problem, I learned that it was a brain injury, which we didn't know about yet, what it was causing. Um, all of those children taught me that if we're here tonight to talk about speech, right?
Yeah,
Speech
sure.
and
Yeah, I guess so.
fluency. Yeah, so let me be specific in that arena, because
Okay.
when we're talking about brain rehab, there's so many things that we humans can do. Speech is just one of the things we do.
Yeah, for sure.
But let me I'll focus in on speech and fluency as a product of neurology and how the brain works. And as I was working with those kids with autism, I got into an arena that took me several years to wrap my head around. It's called sensory integration.
Mm-hmm.
And sensory integration, another way to call it, is functional neurology, understanding that everything we do and master and can perform as a person, we do it because our brain synthesizes and moves all the information from one brain center to another. So that's called sensory integration. The output, what we express, is actually reflected of how our brain sorts and categorizes all that information.
Mm-hmm.
And for speech, what I've come to understand is that there's so many different brain centers that have to work together in sync to produce speech. So the first area is listening, sounds. To learn language, to learn your mother tongue,
Mm-hmm.
you have to be able to hear what is spoken and understand what is spoken even before your mouth can reproduce those information,
Mm-hmm.
those bits and pieces.
Yeah.
So that's called auditory processing. And if a child grows up with ear infections, or maybe the two ears are not processing sounds the same way, the listening part or the hearing part of language and speech may actually not be as integrated as um, at the best level that could be there.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I also know that movement, the body's movement of the part that does the speech, your tongue, your jaw, your lips,
Yeah.
those are obvious parts of speech, right? I mean,
For sure. Yeah.
someone in high school could analyze, oh yeah, in order to talk, you've got to be able to coordinate your tongue, your lip, your jaw.
Mm-hmm.
And those are the obvious movement parts. But what's not so obvious is how much breath support, coordination of breath, coordinated with swallowing, is actually quite vital to get speech out.
Exactly. Exactly. I agree with that for sure.
Right. And so this is part of where, as an occupational therapist, and speech therapists would do this too, is we analyze all the parts of
Mm-hmm.
speaking, and that when you sit and think about it, speech and fluency happens when you exhale, and
Mm-hmm.
that very few of us are able to speak when we inhale.
Right.
But in order to exhale and inhale so that you can have oxygen, because if you are not taking oxygen, your brain doesn't want to speak.
Mm-hmm.
Your
Yeah.
brain actually needs oxygen.
For sure.
So what I've learned with a lot of folks that I've over the years that have struggled with fluency is that the inhalation and exhalation pattern, which should be automatic because it's an automatic nervous system function, doesn't have the full integration that it might have. And so that's a not so obvious issue with speech. Um, Being able to manage your swallowing mechanism and your saliva is part of coordinating that background in order for you to speak over that.
Mm-hmm.
You're kind of speaking over the swallowing mechanisms.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But if you don't have full control of your swallow mechanism, it might be a hindrance.
Right. It'd be impossible. Yeah.
So another thing that's not so obvious as a therapist, that when we look at what makes it difficult for somebody to be fluent with
Mm-hmm.
their speech, is that moving the mouth, the tongue, that's an area we call a distal movement on the body. Distal means away from the midline.
Mm-hmm.
In order to move anything of the body that's away from the midline, your mouth, your fingers, your feet, you need to have a core stability. We call it proximal stability. Core stability of your head, your neck, your shoulders, even your pelvis. That is an indication that you're mastering gravity, that your body is mastering gravity. And as a therapist, I've noticed that there's some kids who has a hard time sitting in a chair or controlling their body. And if they can't control their body, they might not be able to control their mouth and tongue and swallowing and
Mm-hmm.
breathing. So as a therapist, I would probably work on a lot on those core stability issues. We do a lot of that in the sensory integration work. Another thing that's I've learned since I've been doing body work, which we're going to talk about in a little bit.
Yeah.
In doing the body work, I've learned it by actually having my hands on my patient's body.
Right.
When my hands are not on the body, I've missed so much information. So 20 years ago, I started learning various forms of body work. And the amount of information you can learn from the person's body when you actually are touching it is tenfold.
It is interesting. It's crazy. Yeah.
Yeah. So here, for example, your rib cage is it is part of the breathing mechanism. It protects and holds the lungs. It protects and holds the heart. And it also has to move with that breathing, sucking, swallowing, inhalation, exhalation. There are 24 ribs. And of those 24 ribs, there are 150 attachments to the spine and the sternum. And any one of those 150 attachments can be off, structurally off.
Yeah.
Like, a rib displaced or two ribs pushed together, or maybe half of the rib cage is pulled off. Okay. When that structural malalignment happens, breath control is hard to master. Yeah. And most people won't know their ribs are off until somebody touches the ribs to say, you don't have symmetry in your rib cage. Mm-hmm. Sometimes you can see it with the eye, but most of the time you have to palpate it with your hands. There's another thing that has come to light only recently. In the last couple of years have I been hearing about that, and that is the freedom of the Adam's apple to move. So your Adam's apple is actually a bone called the hyoid bone. It's right in your throat, right? It's supposed to go up and down. It has close to 36 attachments of ligaments and muscles that attach to your collarbones, your jawbone, the bottom of your tongue, into the base of your neck, and all the way back to your vertebrae. Those almost 36 attachments are supposed to be loose and floaty to allow that Adam's apple to freely move, because it moves with talking and swallowing and head control. Until I learned how to palpate this, I didn't give the Adam's apple much notice.
Right.
And then I started feeling if people's Adam's apples were moving or not. The hyoid bone is supposed to be freely floating in 10 directions, maybe more. So one of the things we do in treatment is to test the 10 directions to see if you have ligamentous flexibility. And that has a huge effect on speaking, breathing, swallowing, talking.
Everything.
Everything.
Yeah.
Everything in that area. So that's the structural parts. I did talk a little bit about how the brain synthesizes information with language. It's really complicated up there in that brain, right? You hear all this information. You see how people talk. A child watches somebody forming words with their mouth, and they want to start talking. They start copying what their mom and dad and their siblings were saying to them.
Yeah.
And that's a process of the left and right sides of your brain moving information across the middle. So we call that, the hemispheres are cross-communicating all the time at a rapid pace. But what if the structures that surround the brain are hindering the movement of that information? And that's where the craniosacral therapy comes in, because we can feel if those structures are loose or tight. How do we do that? Well, the structures that surround the brain, they're called meninges, and they are attached to bone. They are also, we've just recently discovered that the meninges are attached by muscle fibers. So we can feel through deep muscles if you have tension around the structures that surround the brain, the spinal cord, and the nerves, the cranial nerves that control speech and talking and
Mm-hmm.
fluency. There's another part of the brain that is highly involved in speech production, and that's the cerebellum. And the cerebellum not only coordinates body movement, it coordinates mouth movements. It coordinates your automatic tongue and throat and chewing movement. It also coordinates the movements that you want to, we call them voluntary or volitional movements with the mouth parts. We also have learned that the cerebellum is the center that actually synthesizes speech. It's not just the top part of the brain, but the slower part of the brain in the back of your head
Uh-huh. Isn't it like over
synthesizes
here?
speech.
Mm-hmm.
Back there,
It
yes.
is, yeah. Mm-hmm.
In the sensory integration world, um, I've had 25 years of clinical observations that even nonverbal kids, when they start moving and we activate their cerebellum by a lot of um, swings and vestibular information. Vestibular information is one of the quickest ways we believe to activate and turn on the cerebellum. And for putting information in that helps activate and move around the processes of that brain center. And we find kids who struggle to talk actually talk better when they're doing sensory integration activities.
Yeah.
And we theorize that it has something to do with we've activated the cerebellum structures
Mm-hmm.
through the um, vestibular and something we call proprioception, which is body sense, body pressure. The cerebellum processes that information primarily. So that's
A whole lot of
kind of in the
information.
nutshell of what I do as a therapist. I'm in private practice.
Yeah.
Um, Being in private practice about 20 years, 25 years now in private practice, that allowed me the freedom to go learn whatever interested me. I didn't have the constraints of a director or a clinic that's
Right.
saying what I should and should not learn how to do in my practice. I had total autonomy.
Hmm.
So I went off and learned craniosacral therapy. And I have to tell you, that was a total game changer in my practice.
Mm-hmm.
When you don't touch the body parts of the client that you're trying to work with, you do not understand the information that that body part is telling you. You're
Mm-hmm.
only learning it when you're not touching your client's throat and tongue and jaw, and you're just trying to help them by across the table by
Yeah.
seeing it.
Yep.
You're just getting visual information
Mm-hmm.
about what they're struggling with. When we learn techniques to actually touch the connective tissue, where the nerve actually lays on the muscle that controls the structure, or the fascia that surrounds every structure.
Mm-hmm.
And if it's tense or twisted, that may keep a structure from moving. That's where we actually learn the what the body knows. The laying our hands on people in this therapeutic way, craniosacral therapy,
Mm-hmm.
is akin to biofeedback, but it's much more like a body scan using our hands.
Mm-hmm.
What I mean by that is if we just put biofeedback leads on somebody just to see how much tension they have, if this is a stress related thing, the EMG leads that are put on the body only pick up tension about a quarter to a half an inch into the muscle or
Yeah.
into the body structures.
Mm-hmm.
Biofeedback machines are not picking up deep structural tensions around the spinal cord, around the lungs, around the diaphragm, but our hands do. Our hands, in the therapeutic environment, can pick up those tensions. So let me tell you more about what craniosacral therapy is about.
Mm-hmm.
It was discovered and created by a physician in the 1970s and 1980s by John. His name is John Upledger.
I'm
He
gonna
was an
jot that down.
osteopathic physician, a DO,
Mhm.
and he had come through medical school with the older osteopathic manipulation training to understand the structural and the physical aspects of how the human body worked. He was practicing as a general practitioner and made some discoveries about the connective tissue and how these meninges work or don't work. And if cerebral spinal fluid is not moving through the central nervous system, structures can't work as well.
Mhm.
So he left his practice and went to Michigan State and studied this physiological system of the meninges and the pump around the brain and spinal cord that actually moves cerebral spinal fluid through. That's the basic physiology of how our entire nervous system works.
Mhm.
Out of his 7 years of research at Michigan State, he created these therapeutic techniques known as craniosacral therapy. And it was hard to believe at the time that this first hit the market because there were all kinds of claims that, oh, it will work for anything. It can help with any kind of problem. And so for 10, 12 years, I heard about it, but I didn't take a class because it sounded way too weird
Yeah.
and just way too foreign for
Yeah.
my psychic to wrap around.
Mhm.
But then I finally took a class. And the thing about craniosacral therapy is you have to experience it to understand what it's all about. I can sit here and talk about it all night long,
Yeah.
and you're not going to understand it until you get on the table and you feel it because it is an
Mhm.
experiential treatment where the practitioner can help you identify where you have physical, structural, and even emotional holds in your body.
Mhm. Yeah.
There's a phrase that in other professions are using this, so it's not we don't own this phrase. We say it a lot, but the phrase is that the body remembers everything that happens to it,
Mm.
and that emotions are stored in the tissues. A psychiatrist by the name of Bessel van der Kolk wrote a book called The Body Keeps Score: Brain, Mind, and Body in the Healing of Trauma. And he speaks of the value of body work as a way to not only help heal PTSD and perpetual patterns of trauma, but it's a way to actually find out what are the structures in the body that are remembering what it felt like to be in that situation that
Mhm.
set off fight or flight response.
Right.
How does that relate to stuttering and fluency? Sometimes a traumatic event, physical, emotional, chemical
Mhm.
um, event, can create a situation where body parts freeze,
Mhm.
because that's what fight or flight or freeze is.
Yeah.
That
That's
is
what
the
it does.
autonomic nervous system's physiological reaction to stress
Mhm.
or fear. Um, it's visceral. It's run by the vagal nerve or not,
Mhm.
or the lack thereof.
Yeah.
Um, with body work, what we can feel with our hands is where the body is storing that kind of energy and tension that keeps nerves and muscles and organs tight. Because just the word fluency for stuttering,
Right.
it's a perfect word about what's happening. Is fluency is about things moving,
Mhm.
right?
100%.
And in the osteopathic world of medicine, they have a basic premise of health is that things that are moving are healthy, and things that are not moving or stagnant are not so healthy.
Mhm.
And the world of craniosacral therapy, which is an osteopathic um, treatment approach follows that same premise. Our hands as a therapist are to help find what structures are not fluid and not soft and flexible and moving,
Mm-hmm.
and find ways to help them soften and move so that they become fluent.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Take example neck pain. We actually have a couple published clinical studies um, that that prove that craniosacral therapy is helpful in reducing and eliminating neck pain. And different than chiropractic care or myofascial release or massage or traditional physical therapy, because we are feeling different structures in the neck and the shoulders than those other traditional methods.
Mm-hmm.
And what we feel for in the neck with cranial sacral work is the connective tissue and the muscle and the bone attachments that might need more precise touch
Mm-hmm.
and a gentle sustained stretch. That alone is what separates this therapy from anything else out there, is the
Right.
gentle sustained stretch, which we believe actually lengthens fascia that wraps around nerves and muscles and just structures like your tongue.
Mm-hmm.
You know, your tongue is made up of skin and it's a big muscle, but it's also wrapped around with fascia. And fascia, as it turns out, has these long fibers, which may be nerves. We don't know exactly. They're called telecytes.
Mm-hmm.
But I have a feeling they're nerves because fascia contracts as a whole unit, like a turtle pulling into its shell,
Mm-hmm.
when the nervous system, when the autonomic nervous system perceives a threat, either real or a habitual reaction to a threat,
Mm-hmm.
or embarrassment, or
Right.
maybe a structural strain. Maybe there is something, maybe there's a bone out of in the neck that's out of alignment that's always pulling on the throat or the tongue.
Mm-hmm.
And when you go try to move it, there's always that structural restriction. So these long fibers in the fascia, the telecytes, may pull in as a way of self-protection and self-preservation
Mm-hmm.
as a reaction to the stress. Um, So, what else do you want me to say?
That's so much information. That's crazy. Well, I can just keep going down the line here if you want. Could you
And I
your
have
what?
lost my sound.
Your sound? Oh no. You lost your sound. You can't hear me at all right now? Just type in the chat maybe over here. You lost your sound. um, do you want me to call you? Hold on, guys, one sec. Okay, I'm gonna call her really quick so we can get back to the audio. Um, Sue. Phone.
Hi.
Okay, I think we got it hopefully here.
Yeah, sorry about that. That was I was afraid of this old computer losing its audio.
Okay, one second. Um, I'll turn it off here. Okay, I think we got it here.
All right. What's the last thing you heard me say?
All right. Well, I can just ask you here. I can just ask you something quick.
Sure.
Hopefully everyone can hear you okay. 1 second.
I'll keep my phone real close here.
Okay. All right, so let's see. All right. Could could sorry, could um could you talk about the case the case
Sure.
yeah, and all of that,
Yeah.
if you don't mind.
So my mentor and my craniosacral therapy mentor, who mentored me for 10 years in the advanced levels of craniosacral therapy, she and I just wrote a book. And it's off to the printer. So it should be, can I plug my book here?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, it's off to the printer and it should be available hopefully by the end of the year. It's called A Touch Better.
A touch better. All right.
And it's a accumulation of the little known story of how Dr. Upledger put together his research, but then went off and created a training institute so that the world would know what he was learning and put it into practice.
Mm-hmm.
And then my co-author, her name's Gail Bremen, we each wrote a couple chapters of how we actually put this strange work that people didn't understand what the name meant.
Mm-hmm.
And we wanted to tell our story of how we learned it and put it into practice. And then we wanted to also share the case studies of this remarkable work because it really did transform lives. And it is across diagnostic groups. So we are at a point with this work that it can help anything.
Yeah.
So when we were putting together our case studies, I had a very fascinating study on a young girl, and I'll just say how the case study was written up.
Mm-hmm.
She was a teenager, and she found her way to my office looking for speech therapy, which was not available, but the mom was at our front desk, and she overheard me say something about, oh yeah, that kid who used to stutter, he doesn't stutter anymore. And the mom overheard that. And she goes, you can help stuttering? And I go, well, we have worked with people where stuttering is one of the things that they are wanting to work on.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yep.
And so her daughter came in for a trial run. And I suggested that let's try 3 sessions and see what happens.
Mm-hmm.
So she came in, and the things that I discovered when my hands were on her body as she was trying to talk, is that her rib cage completely froze when the stuttering came out. Like she literally stopped breathing.
That's crazy.
As she was talking. And she did not know that before. She did not realize that she stopped breathing.
Mm-hmm.
She did not realize that her diaphragm froze in the chest cavity and moved upward in the rib cage. She did not know that until we felt it with my hands.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
She and I felt it together.
Yeah.
So my hands were like biofeedback method for her.
Yeah. Yeah.
We had her. Together, she and I discovered how all of those 24 ribs did or did not move while she inhaled and exhaled. She felt tension in her throat. I went and felt where that tension was at. And anyway, so that was our first 3 sessions. And by the end of the first 3 sessions, she felt like her stuttering was solved.
Mm-hmm.
And she went back to school, and I said, come back anytime you want to revisit this. Because with craniosacral therapy, we put the client in charge of how much work they want to do.
Of everything, yeah.
We want them in the driver's seat of their own health care.
So I didn't hear from her for a while, and then maybe a year later, she calls and said her stuttering is back, and even worse. And so we decided to explore more than just structure, more than just breath.
Mm-hmm.
So we got into what we call dialogue, which basically means a conversation.
Mm-hmm.
And I started asking her more questions about, well, when does stuttering happen? When do you find that and she called it the words get stuck in her throat. So that was her words.
Mm-hmm.
When did the words get stuck in your throat? Well, mainly when I'm in a social setting and when I think people are looking at me, and when there's a lot of words in my head.
Yeah.
They just can't get out.
That's true.
Yeah. So it's like there's a small door and a lot of words crowding behind that door, and only one word maybe can get out.
Yeah.
And then the door slams shut.
Right.
And then she stops breathing, and then her diaphragm seizes up, and then she gets frustrated, and then she gets embarrassed, and then she tightens up even more. So this is the physical scenario we're feeling during the process of craniosacral-therapy. But we went on exploring more of the emotional part of it.
Mm-hmm.
And I asked her, when was the first time in her life she remembered? And she's like, oh, well, like forever. And I go, really? Forever? I go, when you were a little kid, little kid, were you stuttering? She goes, no. And I go, what do you remember? And she goes, and then something happened to her body that is really unique to the craniosacral therapy process, is this thing we call the craniosacral rhythm, which we believe to be the manifestation of the cerebral spinal fluid filling and inflating the brain and spinal cord 6 to 10 times per minute. We know it's there because we can see it in neurosurgery. So within everybody's body, your brain and spinal cord are inflating and deflating 6 to 10 times per minute.
Mm-hmm.
And we believe it sends out waves of movement through the body because it's water, right? It's water displacement. And Dr. Upledger discovered in his research that when people were talking about events or things that were significant to what's going on, this rhythm stops. And it stops like on a dime, like somebody hit the brakes.
Mm-hmm. For sure.
So as I was chatting with this girl about when she could remember at what age did this all happen, her rhythm stopped. And she goes, I was thrown in the swimming pool as a little girl. And then she remembered another event. Not long after that, she was thrown in the lake.
Mm.
And then there was another time she was thrown in the pool again, all by family members who were playing at family events,
mm-hmm.
who were trying to engage her in swimming.
Mm-hmm.
And rather than ask her to get in with them, they just threw her in the pool. And she said, I can swim. I'm a good swimmer. She goes, I just don't like swimming. I really hate swimming. I'd rather sit on the side and read a book.
Mm-hmm.
But here she was being thrown in the water against her will, and she's screaming for help, and everybody's laughing at her, calling her a scaredy cat. So this is her telling her the story as she remembers it.
Right.
And by the way, the whole time she's talking, she's not stuttering.
It's all smooth, yeah, of course.
She's completely fluent.
Yeah, interesting.
And the whole time she's telling me this story, my hands are on her rib cage and on her diaphragm, and I'm just feeling what's loose and moving and what tightens up, when it tightens up, where it tightens up.
Yeah.
And so she gets into this situation where she starts sobbing and crying and remembering the fear and the being afraid. And so I just asked her to remember to feel it, where in her body she feels that. And, her lungs, her throat, her bronchial. She's starting to feel more inside than she ever has. She goes, I didn't even know I could feel my bronchial tubes. Yeah. And yet she could during the session. And the story continues as she's telling me, and I'm asking her to just remember whatever details, not prodding, just asking her to as many specifics as she can. Who was doing this? What were they saying? What did you want them to say that they didn't say? And so she's processing the fear of these three events.
Mm-hmm.
And they, like, total, I think it was like a span of 4 or 5 years. And she was a young girl.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And she finishes crying, and we both think, is this the end of it? And then her rhythm stops again. And then she goes, oh my God, I am so mad at my parents. I am so mad at them.
Yeah.
She goes, and I go, what made you so mad? She goes, because I feel like I'm dying and they're not listening to me. They're laughing at me. And I said, when else have you felt like you've not been heard and that you can't get your voice out? And then she just stops, like, stops thinking, stops talking. Her rhythm's completely still. And she goes, that's why I stutter. She goes, why should I get my voice out if nobody's listening to me? And that was the end of the session.
That's crazy.
And that was how I wrote the case study. And I said, come back and see us anytime you want, anytime you felt like you need a tune-up. And at the time I wrote the case study, we hadn't heard back from her, and it had been 5 years. Now, it's interesting. She's recently come back just for a tune-up because she's now in college, and she's really under stress.
Oh, I'm sure,
in college, as she's trying to get her career done.
Yeah.
And some of these old memories are coming back, and so she's come back in for a few more sessions for us to just revisit. And you know, when she grows up, where those structural tightnesses in her lungs and her spine and her neck have been held, sometimes a growth spurt can actually make it tighten it up again. Because the connective tissue, especially the connective tissues and nerves, might not be as pliable as the bones that are growing rapidly. So oftentimes with anything that I treat, when kids go through a growth spurt, that's really a good time to get retreated and have a tune-up. So that's the case study. It made it into the book.
Awesome.
And it just was, I did not know we were going to make those discoveries. But what that case and many of the cases in this book that we wrote about is the connection between the mind and the body and the spirit and the psyche. And the structural parts of the body and where emotions and events and traumas are held. Now, does everybody with stuttering and fluency problems have a trauma like that? Probably not. They have their own events and their own interpretations and their own perceptions of what has happened to them in their life. And so the craniosacral therapy process is to explore that mind-body connection and have the subconscious have a conversation with the conscious mind and the conscious body. I've reached the opinion after all these years of doing this work that I believe the subconscious is actually the signals from the body. It's actually the sensory and the motor parts of our body from our neck down is where the subconscious is held. And the body remembers everything that happens to it. The body also knows what's going on. The body knows what's going on with stuttering and fluency. And it also knows how to fix it. So we therapists, we practitioners, we need to get better and more competent at listening to what the body's trying to tell us.
Yeah.
And for me as a therapist, I found it by actually touching body parts that are involved in speaking and fluency. Yeah. So
that's amazing. That is amazing stuff. That is amazing. Wow.
Yeah.
That's incredible.
So as Dr. Upledger would say, craniosacral therapy is experiential, meaning you need to be on the table receiving it from a competent therapist to understand what it has to offer you. So his favorite saying would be, get on the table.
Yeah.
Just get on the table and try it.
Get on the table. That's unreal.
And at this point in my career, I still do the sensory integration and the functional neurology. But 95% of what I do in my practice full time now is craniosacral therapy, other kinds of body work, visceral manipulation, lymphatic drainage, myofascial release. All of those complement each other, so I kind of blend them into this menagerie we call body work. But I treat nearly anything and everything that walks into my door, into my clinic. Because it's not about the diagnosis. We get so hung up on diagnoses. We get hung up on labels and behavioral interpretations. And the thing is if we would just listen to the body, the body knows exactly what's going on. And so my assessment is so much more quickly received and figured out because I'm not the one who has to figure it out. The person on the table helps me figure it out.
Yeah, it's already there for you.
So the therapy process is a 50-50.
Yeah.
Learning process. Yeah.
Gosh, it's
so
crazy.
it raises insights for the person on the table who may not know how their body's working, their body and their brain. So.
Wow.
Yeah, game changer. The body work was a game changer for my career. I have lots of colleagues who have said the same thing. I will take note of a trend that I'm observing in healthcare in general, that practitioners who have found ways to really help people, one, they're going into private practice, going into cash practices, because the big, large corporate clinics are just not allowing the time, the freedom for therapists and practitioners to go get trained and learn this. Or if they are, they're not allowing the time allowance it takes to really do the work thoroughly. Because craniosacral therapy, you need a good hour, maybe 2 hours, sometimes even more than that. So it's not something you can provide a treatment for 1 to 2, 3 people in an hour. I mean, you have to focus on one patient at a time.
Yeah.
And in the corporate healthcare, that's just not happening these days. People they have productivity things that are required to be met, and they don't have as much time with their patients.
Right. Yeah, for sure.
So what I see, another trend that I see happening is because Dr. Upledger opened this kind of training to anybody who had a license to touch people. You're going to see a wide variety of people practicing the body work methods, but they may be a physical therapist, a massage therapist, a nurse, a doula, athletic trainer. So as long as you have a license to touch people, the Upledger Institute provides the training. So you're going to, if people are looking for these kind of interventions, they're not going to be looking for a specific profession. They're going to be looking for a specific skill set. And I think that consumers are starting to learn that because most of the referrals come from word of mouth anyway.
Right. Oh yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Now, having said that, the Upledger Institute provides training in over 100 countries. They have 50 satellites around the world. And to date, there have been over 250,000 therapists who have taken some level of training through the Institute. And the Institute has created a resource website where you can find any therapist around the world that has the training, and you can find how extensive their training is. And would you like that website? Would you like me to announce that?
Oh yeah, for sure. Absolutely.
Okay. So the group resource is called the International Alliance of Healthcare Practitioners.
Okay.
And the website is small letters.
Yep.
IAHP.com.
Okay. Perfect.
IAHP, International Alliance of Healthcare Practitioners.com. And there's a link that says find a therapist. You type in your city or your zip code. You can find out if they have specialization in the visceral work, the lymphatic drainage, the craniosacral, brain curriculum. Let me say a little word about the visceral manipulation aspect of this work. It comes from a practitioner out of Paris, France. His name is Jean-Pierre Barral, Barral, Jean Barral. He was a physical therapist and went back to medical school to become an osteopathic physician. And in his anatomy education, he discovered that the organs within our belly cavity, stomach, liver, kidneys, the lungs inside our chest cavities, these organs are surrounded by connective tissue and they're hung by ligaments, and they need to be loose and freely moving. And when they're not, they can actually create back pain. Or they can interfere with how well your heart and lung is moving. So he created a curriculum where we actually are using our hands to, via the connective tissue spots, we can actually loosen and soften the movement and physiology of the organs within our body. So that's why I called it visceral manipulation. And I've been using that with, if we specifically talk about speech fluency and stuttering, going beyond the rib cage, I can feel what the ribs and the rib cage are doing, but to feel the lungs underneath the rib cage, that's a pretty powerful therapeutic tool.
No kidding.
Because we can actually feel whether or not those lungs are expanding inside the chest cavity, and is there rhythm with inhalation and exhalation and timing when they want to talk and get the words out. And it could actually be, the problem with stuttering may actually be happening right there in the chest cavity. And the phrenic nerve that comes off the neck, off the vagal branch, that controls, we can actually feel whether or not that nerve is tight or loose. And if that nerve tightens up, well, maybe there's some things we can do to loosen up that nerve so that the lungs move freely through that autonomic process. So that's the visceral manipulation part. And that's why all these therapies, we call it body work. So some people just get training in craniosacral. Some people take their training to additional branches of this training. And at that IAHP website, you can find out the serious students of the work who really are dedicated to learning as many avenues as possible.
That's amazing. That is amazing. Wow. Oh man, I don't even know what to say to that after that.
Yeah, well, can you imagine my mind when I first heard this stuff? It took me 12 years to take the first class, and then 4 days after I took the first class, my mind was blown. We do not understand anatomy in America. We do not understand that the human body is actually a water balloon. I mean, we're 75-80% water, right? The connective tissue and the organs and the muscles, they just float around in a water medium. And water reacts to stress. So these body work methods are learning how to actually work with something that's a water balloon. And so the intervention is really soft, non-invasive. It is not a massage. It's more of a stretch to the connective tissue to where the nerve innervates things, just to soften and reduce the stress. And what I always see 100% of the time, does not matter what a client comes in for, 100% of the time, there is a positive effect. And I believe the positive effect is we actually help reset the parasympathetic nervous system, the autonomics. Because most people are walking around with some degree of that sympathetic nervous system wrenched up, more so than others. And our whole being is wrapped around whether or not our autonomic nervous system is stressed or not stressed.
Right.
Yeah.
That's amazing. That is amazing stuff.
So, are there questions for me, or?
I mean, I can ask if anyone has any here. If anyone has anything for you. Let's see. We'll have to wait and see. That is some crazy stuff, though, I will say. That's amazing stuff.
Yeah, and people would say, well, only the people who believe this probably would benefit from it. And what I say to that is, I think the people who believe it will help, it will help. I think the people who don't think it's going to help them, but they get on the table anyway, it helps them in some way. I think there are people who aren't comfortable with that kind of intimate connection with a therapist.
Yeah.
And so, sometimes they're not ready for body work.
Yeah.
I just, the science is coming in on this gradually. That's one of the things we included in this book that's about to go to print, is an entire chapter on the collection of scientific justification for craniosacral therapy, as well as the beginnings of some clinical evidence. So there is enough scientific evidence to support the practice of craniosacral therapy, as well as showing the clinical effectiveness is beginning. We need more research, as every body of interventions still need evidence-based. But the science does exist. And
absolutely.
So that we put that together in the chapter at the end of the book, so that it would be in one place for people.
Okay, here's a couple in here for you.
Okay.
I don't know if here, one second. I'm going to hit you with a text of them if you don't mind.
Okay.
That's probably a whole lot easier for me. You mentioned.
Okay.
Hold on one.
No problem.
Yeah, 1 second.
How do treatments different from different stages of life for craniosacral therapy? Okay, good question. Meaning, can anybody at any age benefit from it? The youngest person that I have provided craniosacral for is 6 days old, and the oldest is 92 years old.
Wow, that's crazy.
There is one of our instructors is in Chicago, and he is doing some preliminary studies that craniosacral therapy actually might be reducing early onset Alzheimer's symptoms. That we have some theories that it actually helps clean the brain, because we are moving cerebrospinal fluid and lymphatic fluids as we stretch the connective tissue that wrap around the brain and the spinal cord. I treated a baby 2 weeks ago who had severe reflux and colic. And every time she would eat, she would spit up. It was even coming out her nose. She was in distress. So was the mother.
Yeah.
And when I talked about the Adam's apple, I went on this teeny tiny little baby. She was 5.5 pounds, and her Adam's apple was pulled up behind the jaw. I mean, it wasn't even in the middle of the throat where it was supposed to be. And so she couldn't even normally have a swallow pattern because structurally something got pulled out of alignment. And I found out later she had the vacuum extracted for birth because she got stuck in the birth canal. And she got stuck in the birth canal because she had a short umbilical cord. And a short umbilical cord can pull on your organs. And when your organs are pulled on, your vagal nerve is pulled on. And so within 3 to 4 sessions, this baby's structure was all normalized, and the reflux stopped, and the colic stopped, and she just normalized. Had that baby not been treated, I showed her to think what would she have grown into. An eating disorder, a speech disorder, a failure to thrive, not being able to eat her food. I have no idea what we prevented. I treat people of all ages. I treat a lot of concussions. We're involved in a 10-year chart review study now with all of our concussion patients, just to investigate how they felt that the treatment helped them with their concussion symptoms. Kid falls on the playground, bumps his head, and has word-finding problems. Well, it turns out the front bone of his skull is pushed in slightly, not a fracture, but pushed in enough that we think the cerebrospinal fluid around the left hemisphere of his brain is not flowing. And if we were able to treat something like that pretty quickly, we can reverse the effects of that structural injury, and then his brain can heal. I work with pregnant ladies. Working with pregnant ladies are interesting because you actually are treating 2 people at one time.
Yeah, no kidding.
And you can actually feel the baby's craniosacral rhythm. You can feel their own space, and that's a really cool thing to do. I've had a couple situations where I've treated the baby in utero, and then the baby's born, and then mom brings the baby in for the post-birth treatment, which really helps unwind the structural strain of just getting born. And there was a couple babies who, they had a look at me that said, I recognize you. I know you.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's my interpretation. That's my psychological projection.
For sure.
But I that's what I'm going to hold on to.
Yeah, I would hold on to that forever. Yeah, that's
what
awesome.
motivates me to keep working. I just worked with a lady today who had been sitting at a red light. There was a major car accident in the road, the perpendicular road, and a car comes flying through the air and hits her head on as she's sitting on a stoplight. And she has nowhere to go, but she doesn't remember the impact, but she remembers after the impact. And we think she hit her head on the steering wheel. And she is having, speaking of fluency, she is having fluency problems. And she hit the left side of her frontal bone, frontal lobe and I've only seen her one time. But she also had a really bad whiplash, which is, by the way, a concussion of the spinal cord. And I treated her 1 hour, and after the treatment, her fluency had returned, just with one treatment.
Yeah. That's all it takes, huh? It's that easy?
You know, when I first was learning the work and I wasn't as good as I am now, and I wasn't as competent and wasn't as confident, I would tell people, oh, you need to try 6 to 8 sessions to see if it will help.
Yeah.
And now, because I've had a lot of teachers teach me how to get to the core of something, we can see changes in 1 to 3 sessions.
Yeah.
So it's
That's
the
cool.
kind of treatment that you want to find somebody who is trained. But that doesn't mean if you only have one person in town, you don't try that person. You experience it, and when you travel, go book an appointment with somebody in another town, and explore it as a possibility of what it might mean for your own health struggles or quality of life. I would say quality of life is one of the biggest things that changes. When your sympathetic nervous system is controlling your life as opposed to the relaxed state, your thoughts change, your neurochemistry changes. We know through the polyvagal theory that when your body is structurally tight, you're producing stress chemicals. And stress chemicals just, in turn, keep tightening up structures. On the other hand, when you're in that relaxed parasympathetic state, your whole body neurochemistry changes, which then fires endorphins, which make you feel really good and really happy. And that, in turn, keeps relaxing your body and all your body structures so they actually work better. And that can happen back to the question here, that can happen at any age of the lifespan. Trying to think of some other things. Well, I'm working, just today I was working with a gentleman who had severe back injuries, like ruptured discs and a couple back surgeries that didn't go well. And he now has a electrical wire implanted in his spine to control pain. Yeah.
Yikes.
Yeah, it even sounds, it is as bad as it sounds.
It sounds horrible, yeah.
And he's been living with this electrical, it's like a TENS unit that's not outside, it's a TENS unit inside. So he gets to crank up this little dial on this gadget he wears on his belt to, send some electrical frequencies that can override the pain. The problem is, it doesn't take his pain away. It is kind of helps him.
Yeah.
It allows him to function, but it doesn't take away his pain. So he learned about our work, and he came for a few sessions, and now he comes once a month, and he's pain-free. And now he thinks, why do I have this wire in my back? Which will always be there because they're never going to take it out.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So he's pain-free. He comes once a month, and we just loosen up the tight structures that were caused by life's traumas and dramas that got held in his tissues.
Interesting.
And he's in his upper 50s.
Yeah. Interesting.
Yeah.
So I have some other thing here for you real quick.
Okay.
This will be... There you go.
When are you starting your own stream? When I retire. And then somebody wants to know what's the name of the book again. The name of the book is called A Touch Better.
A Touch Better. Perfect.
By Gail Bremen, Breman, and Susan von Kratz.
There you go. Perfect.
Took 5 years to write that book.
It did, huh?
Yeah.
That's awesome. That's so cool.
We wanted the book, the whole intention of the book was to weave the work, as John called it, Dr. Upledger called it, the work. We wanted all the threads of the work about what it meant, so that anybody who was new to the world of craniosacral and was just interested in what it meant could get something out of the book. It's also going to be designed for the young therapists to help offer them a roadmap of how to get trained in it and apply it to their own practice. But we also wanted to write it towards the other healthcare professionals, especially the physicians or the psychologists who may be the ones who need to be making referrals for this type of intervention.
Mm-hmm.
And so we actually wrote it to the entire population.
Yeah.
It was quite the endeavor.
I believe it. Well, all right. I think that's it. I think that's all we got here today. I think that was all good, I thought.
That's a plenty, they say.
Yeah, exactly. That's tons of stuff. Wow, that's a whole bunch of information.
Yeah, I tried to be concise.
No, it was good though. It was awesome.
But see, as an occupational therapist, that's what we do. We're Gestalt thinkers.
Yeah.
I have to work at not being a Gestalt talker.
No, you're
be
doing
real
great.
Concise and be real focused.
Yeah. No, that was awesome. That was great. So yeah. So I
My
think.
pleasure.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right.
Alrighty.
Have a good evening.
Okay, you too. Have a great night.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. All right. All right. All right, all right, all right. Well, hope everyone enjoyed that. That was pretty amazing, not gonna lie. That was pretty cool to hear about everything like that. Whole bunch of information. Whole bunch of information. Crazy stuff. Well, I'm pretty hungry, so I am hopping off here. Hope everyone enjoyed the stream tonight. Oh yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I'll have her on again for sure. Absolutely. For sure. Hope everyone has a good Tuesday evening. I'm gonna head and eat some food here. So yeah. Alright everybody. Have a great night. I'll be back again in a week. Enjoy.